Today's topic is bridging the gap, Muslim communities and their governments. Oasis of Dialogue is a very important activity when it comes to Qatar debates activities. Oasis of Dialogue is the branch of Qatar debate that take us away from the idea of debating and competing and having different views, trying to fight each other when it comes to words and argumentation. Oasis of Dialogue is the place where we bring different kind of people to have different kind of ideas and prospects about different topics. So in today's topic, we brought three guest speakers. I'm going to start with Lynda Sarsour. Lynda is an award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, seasoned community organizer, direct action strategist, and mother of three as well. She's the co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, Empower Change, and co-founder of Until Freedom, an intersectional racial justice organization. She was one of the national co-chairs of the largest single-day protest in U.S. history, the Women's March on Washington. She has been named among 500 of the most influential Muslims in the world. She was recognized as one of the Fortune's 50 greatest leaders and featured as one of the Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Welcome, Lynda. We also have Dr. Dalia Fahmy. Dr. Dalia Fahmy is an associate professor of political science at Long Island University. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Policy in Washington, D.C., and a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights and UNESCO chair at Rutgers University for 2018. Dr. Fahmy has published several articles in academic journals focusing on democratization and most recently on the effects of Islamophobia on U.S. foreign policy. She has given several briefings on the future of democracy in the Middle East. In 2014, Dr. Fahmy was one of the recipients of the prestigious Kliegman prestigious Kliegman Prize in Political Science. Welcome, Doctora. We say in Arabic, ختامها مسك, introducing Trita Parsi, an award-winning author and the 2010 recipient of the Gromeyer. Excuse my ignorance when it comes to these prizes.
I didn't know it either until I got it.
Award for Ideas Improving World Order. He is an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign policy, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. Trita has authored 3 books on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Iran and Israel. And we had a discussion about your first book as the closest to your heart, let me say, when it comes to the depth. The last thing is that he was named by the Washingtonian magazine as one of the 25 most influential voices on foreign policy in Washington, D.C. in both 2021 and 2022. Welcome, Trita.
Thank you.
Now back to our subject, bridging the gap, aligning Muslim communities with their governments. So the topic is not an easy one to talk about. And I think we have an amazing guest speakers here to enrich the dialogue when it comes to these kind of topics. So I'll start first in a very brief way to put this question. When it comes to the U.S., Lynda, are Muslims represented here in the U.S.?
That's a very big question, Hamad, that you started with. I don't believe that U.S. Muslims are represented in this current political environment that we are in. I don't think Muslims have really ever been represented, not in our values, not in our principles as Muslims. I think what we are starting to see is more political involvement of Muslim American communities in politics in the United States of America. We are seeing more American Muslims who are running for office, both on the very local level in their community as well as high as the echelons of Congress. As you know, we have 3 members of the current U.S. Congress who are Muslims. But that's just the beginning. And I think there is a lot more for us to do as Muslim Americans, taking and leveraging democracy in a way that protects the interest of our community, particularly those who are marginalized in our community, immigrants, refugees, people of color, who are also Muslims, poor working class Muslims. There's just a lot more work to do. So we're doing what we can, but I will say that we are in a place where there is just much more work to be done.
Great, thank you so much, Linda, for this answer. And I want to go from this answer to Dalia and ask her about representation. When it comes to someone being represented or a community being represented, what do we mean by that? Like, can we, at the end of the day, measure this idea of representation?
So let's look at the Muslim population in the United States. It's about 3.8 million people, which is 1.1% of the population. But the representation, if we're talking about measurable representation, is in terms of the perception of Islam and Muslims in the United States. According to Gallup, 78% of Americans have a negative association with the word Islam and Muslims. And this comes from somewhere, right? So we can talk about the data. For example, comparison between the year 2000 and 2020, just the past 20 years per se. Mm-hmm. In the year 2000, we had according to the State Department, 1,200 mosques. In 2020, there's 2,800. Which means the number of mosques has doubled, right? The number of Muslims in political office, 2007, we had our first 2 members of Congress. 2017, we had the election of Ilhan and Rashida. So in terms of the growth of the Muslim community, the activity of the Muslim community being represented in political spaces, it has not happened organically. What happened was when President Trump was running for office, the attacks on Islam, but also the physical attacks on Muslims hit an all-time high in 2016. So 2016, according to the FBI, the Southern Poverty Law Center, CNN, was the most violent year for Muslims, where they were attacked physically. We're not talking about just negative perception association. We're talking about the burning down of mosques, the attacks on Islamic school, the attacks on women in hijab. That led to a galvanizing moment where the Muslim response was to indeed run for office. And so you saw it between 2000 and 2020 and 2022. In both of those election cycles, you saw a watershed moment of Muslims running for office. Mm-hmm. And you saw in the last one, 83 Muslims win at the local, state, and national level. And so that's reflective of Muslims were under attack, continue to be under attack, and the representation still comes from a place of we don't belong, right? We don't belong, and we're not perceived of as belonging. But if you look at the data on Muslims, for example, Muslim women in the United States are the second most highly educated religious minority grouping. Muslim women are, in terms of religious minority groups, the highest in terms of philanthropic giving. Muslim women are, their economic earning parity, there isn't much parity, which means that we are equal in our earning capacity compared to other women of color. And so the active Muslim woman in the United States is actually an asset to the country because she does so in her capacity as a citizen of the country and also through her religious duties and obligations. Yeah. And yet is women of color in general, but in this case Muslim women, are the most visibly attacked institution and symbol of Islam. And we can talk about why and where that comes from. But in terms of representation, even our political wins, right, are pale in comparison to our numbers and our efforts, and our political achievements happen under the backdrop of extreme repression and targeting. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of dynamic we have to talk about in terms of representation.
Can I just add one quick thing,
Of course,
Mohammed?
go ahead.
I think it's important to actually think about representation because this is a problem that happens in a lot of minority communities. Sometimes you see a woman in hijab and you say that represents the Muslim community. We are not a monolithic community. We also live in a country where people have different political views as well, right? So sometimes we do have Muslims. I'll give you an example. There was a Muslim who ran against Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She was a Muslim. She wore hijab. But her views, for me personally, did not align with mine, nor did I believe that if she would have won, that she would have been representative of me as a Muslim American. So I think it's important for us as Muslims that we are also grappling with the idea of somebody who looks like me, who shares the same faith as me, but do they share the same priorities, the same issues? Are they willing to stand up for marginalized people in the same way that I choose to do that? So I think that's the thing that's very complicated about politics in America, is that oftentimes people will say, we need more black women, we need more Latinos, we need more indigenous people, we need more and more, and we need more Jews, and we need more Sikhs, and we need more all different faith groups. The real question we have to ask ourselves as minority communities, as Muslims, is, do the people not only represent us from a demographic and ethnic and religious standpoint, but do they actually reflect our values as Muslims? And that's the struggle that we have even within our own community.
That's a very good way to put it, because I want to ask Dr. Dalia, before going to somewhere outside the border and ask internationally, with Trita, I want to ask you, Dalia, very briefly, when you say representation, let's not talk about the idea of being represented by an individual in a regulatory body, but let's talk about representation in other aspects, like how can we put a threshold, let's say, for the idea of, oh, this community is represented, or that community is not represented? Is there a threshold for that?
So usually we talk about representation in terms of media, television, film. So of the speaking parts that have to do with like Arab, South Asian, Muslim communities, right? Of the speaking parts, there's only been, in I think the past 20 years, 12 that were reflective of Muslims. And of the 12, 9 were during acts of violence. And so the representation of Muslims still in the public realm is very much as a community that is suspect, right? Suspect citizens, yes, they look like us, but they act like us. They might even have the same mantra as us, but they're still suspect, right? They're still questioned. And so imagine what that means for the average young Muslim American, right? So there's a study that's been done about the internalization of Islamophobia, which finds that 1 in 2, which is 50% of Muslim youth, find that they cannot be both Muslim and American. That they don't believe they can be both Muslim and American. And so we can talk here in kind of larger terms, but in terms of the internalization of that narrative, I don't not only see myself not represented, I only see myself represented as a potential person of violence. And so that's what the kind of countering is. So we can talk about thresholds, but we're still coming from a place of negative before we can even talk about what is the positive.
Got you. Thank you so much for this answer. Trita, I studied here in the US, and they taught us about the two presidency theory, and how, especially in the US, you have two separated presidents, let's call it this way. One for the domestic politics and the other one dealing with what's going on outside. So my question is, when it comes to you as a citizen to influence what's going on outside, do people here in the US have a say for that, or do the dynamics of influencing domestic politics really diverse and very far from comparing it with the dynamics of influencing the foreign agenda setting, especially for Muslim communities?
Thank you, and thank you so much to Qatar Debate for having us. This is a fantastic conversation. I'm so glad to be able to be part of it. Before I answer your question, can I make 2 comments on what was said before? First one, in support of what Linda said, in the sense that, and this might not be terribly popular, but if we're going too far down the road of identity politics and thinking that just someone that looks like us is what is needed for representation, I agree with you fully that that is not going to be a very fruitful path. In fact, when you take a look at when AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee's influence really, really quadrupled, was in the mid-1980s when they made a strategic decision not to support candidates based on whether they're Jewish or not, but based on how pro-Israel they were. And they started supporting candidates that were not Jewish against Jewish candidates if that candidate was more pro-Israel by their metric. That suddenly opened up the floodgates for a completely different dimension of influence that they had, which is that they went beyond the idea that it has to be a Jewish person that they're supporting. They were looking at the ideas and the policies. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand a bit of the context when it comes to Islamophobia. If you take a look at the experience of other communities, a community that is often pointed to as a model community, the Asian American community, why can't all other communities follow the same pattern? Well, it's very fascinating. That's not been the case, in the sense that they have not been viewed as a model community for a very long time. In fact, they were extremely badly treated. They were seen as what was called the yellow peril, etc. What shifted was to a large extent geopolitical causes, in which the United States, because of an enmity with Japan, needed to ally with China and quickly change some of the laws that were extremely explicitly discriminatory against Chinese Americans. And with that, later on came another element, which was in order to be able to justify why the United States had failed at integrating and treating African Americans properly, they deliberately lifted up Asian Americans as an example to be able to say, see, it's totally possible to be very successful. It's not because of the system, it's because of that specific community. Mm-hmm. But there was the interplay of these two things that was very essential. And I can say that as an Iranian American, having worked on these issues for 20 years and tried to fight against discrimination that my community faced, I can tell you with no hesitation, there was hardly anything Iranian Americans did or didn't do that has as much of an impact as what the relationship between the US and Iran were. That relationship completely determined how much Iranian Americans were being discriminated against in this country. If you take a look at the Muslim ban of the Trump administration, for instance, that was a ban that primarily targeted Iranians because it was a Muslim ban that geopolitics permitted. It wasn't targeting all Muslim countries. It was targeting the Muslim countries that the United States already had bad relations with. In fact, Iraq was originally included, and within 2 weeks they had to take it out because it looked really dumb to have Iraq included since we had liberated Iraq, right? So it was the Muslim ban that geopolitics permitted. That's not to say that participation in the elections or having representation, et cetera, is not crucial. It absolutely is. But it's also to understand the context and the systemic factors that is affecting these things, which brings me to your question about the impact that a community can have on foreign policy. First, we have to recognize one thing. We're living in a completely dysfunctional political system right now.
Yes, sir.
So the expectation of being able to influence a policy process presumes that there is a functioning policy process. During the Trump years, there wasn't any policy process in the first place. Now, I think we have a highly dysfunctional policy process, which makes it extremely challenging to be able to influence. But let's presume that we go back to some state of normality in which there is a functioning process. Without a doubt, a community can have a profound impact on this. Mm-hmm. But it is extremely related to the extent to which that community is willing to set aside all other priorities in order to make that foreign policy issue an absolute top priority. And really be able to focus on it, particularly when it comes to, as was pointed out, the Muslim community is an extremely diverse community. It has many, many different interests. In order for it to have that type of an influence, it really needs to be able to focus on a few sets of issues and really prioritize that over everything else. Whether that's the right thing to do or not, that's not what I'm judging. I'm saying as to whether you can or cannot. But it really starts at the bottom. This is the only country that I know of that has such a tremendously important grassroots component to the democracy, in the sense that what you're doing out in the districts is essential for that type of influence. Right now, there's a lot of focus, of course, on the tremendous amount of support that Ukraine has received. What is not recognized in this is that the Ukrainians had a game plan that was not focused on Washington alone. They were meeting with their members of Congress out in the districts from day one, extensively. Most members of Congress who were hesitant on what direction to go ended up leaning in the direction in which their district members and the constituents were pushing them towards. And that's where they actually had a very, very fantastic and effective game plan. And it requires that type of an organization. Mm-hmm. And that organization, again, then is based on citizenry that is really willing to spend a lot of time and make that a priority. The political capital is built outside of the country. Meaning out in the districts and the states. It is spent in Washington, but it has to be built out in those states, and that means at the grassroots level.
So if I get your answer right, I think you're saying that nowadays it's not possible, but in normal days or in the past, it used to be possible. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that it's not possible. I'm just saying you have to recognize that. You just saw what happened today on Capitol Hill. This is not, we're a highly functional banana republic right now. Yes. And so the expectation to be able to be influential in a system that is not functioning properly has to be taken into account. I'm not saying it's impossible.
You know, Trita, if I can push back for a second, because we could actually fall into a false consciousness that it's about foreign policy and only foreign policy. There is an aspect to American identity that is inherently Islamophobic, and it goes back to the founding of our nation. So in the 1776 constitutional debates around the ratification of the US Constitution, the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists had to deal with the seat, and they're talking about the seat of the presidency. He says, I don't know if this seat will be one day occupied by a papist or a Mohammedan. And so in the definition, in this kind of par excellence in the history of the negotiation of the US Constitution is, should we have a religious clause in who can be president? And in this debate, it was concluded that we will not have a religious clause and that anyone could be president. But the fear ultimately was that a Muslim could be president. And here we are during the great debate of what is going to become America, and it's inherently Islamophobic. Mm-hmm. And if you move beyond that, we know that today the only acceptable form of public racism is Islamophobia. Mm-hmm. And that the everyday lived experience of all other communities, and this is not to marginalize what other communities have gone through and the reasons why they've gone through them, the one that remains is Islamophobia. Of course, it's built on anti-Black racism, but we're not here for that conversation. But to geopolitically pin it, I think might lead some to not recognize the very strong undergird of identity formation in the United States and how it inherently has been Islamophobic, mm-hmm. and how the kind of requirement of the Muslim community response and how it's been incorrectly done was that we have been, and again, for the past, this is not to negate indigenous Muslims and the Black American experience, but let's say immigrant Muslim communities have treated Muslims in America as Muslims in America and not Muslims of America. Mm-hmm. And until that narrative changes, right, as a community, can the real grassroots pushback that you're talking about be, I think, much more refined and go deeper. But to put it in a geopolitical frame, of course there are ebbs and flows, might actually deny that there has always been an undergird of Islamophobia since the founding of the United States, since the founding fathers were talking about it, since the Federalists, Anti-Federalists were debating it, but also in terms of the definition of what we will be, right? Because he's saying, I don't know if in 500 years, right, they're looking into the future, you know, will there be a majority Muslim population that could actually grab this seat from us? Mm-hmm. And so here we have this really important conversation in the United States that needs to really happen about what does it really mean to be American, right? And some of the mistakes Muslim Americans have made has been in this, we are Muslims in America versus not Muslims of America.
You know, one of the advantages as a moderator is having you guys to lead the question that's going to come next. So thank you so much for introducing the idea of Islamophobia, because this is going to be my question. Islamophobia, when we talk about Islamophobia or hear Islamophobia in news, it's not only like the sentiment or the way that people react to each other, it's also systematic. Absolutely. So how can we see this systematic idea of Islamophobia manifested anywhere here in the US?
I think that's the most important part about Islamophobia and understanding Islamophobia, that oftentimes when people hear anti-Muslim racism or they hear Islamophobia, they think it's my neighbor who doesn't want to interact with me because I'm a Muslim, or maybe because I wear hijab, someone doesn't want to sit next to me at the airport. That's not what we mean by Islamophobia. That's bigotry. That's something that exists amongst all communities. It's something that any minority community will tell you that they have experienced. Islamophobia is similar to other systemic types of racism. The United States government has created actual policies based on this anti-Muslim sentiment. You know, immediately after 9/11, the United States government decided that Muslims were the enemy within. and they based policies on that. They actually created entire new agencies and conglomerates of agencies based on this post 9/11 anti-Muslim sentiment. One of them is the Department of Homeland Security. There was no Department of Homeland Security before 9/11 happened. That was not something that existed. There are joint terrorism task forces that brought all these different agencies together to work. Those did not exist before September 11th. There was a program that came out in 2003 called NSEERS. It was, the acronym was NSEERS, AKA Special Call-in Registration. The United States government had absolutely no shame. They made a list of 25 nation states, most of whom were Arab and or Muslim majority nations, right? They did add North Korea to the list because it throws you off a little bit. So you can't claim it's anti-Arab or anti-Muslim if you add North Korea to it. And it really created a lot of chaos in our communities. It basically called on males over the age of 16 who were not United States citizen or green card holders to come register with the United States government. And for anyone that knows any history about any time a government is calling you to register, that it created a lot of fear in our community. Some people registered, some people did not register. Over 200,000 Muslim males, or around that number, did register with the government, and about 10% of those were on deportation proceedings. The government spent millions and millions of taxpayer dollars for a program that was supposed to catch terrorists. That was the point of the program. They caught nobody, 0 people. Not a single human being of all those people that went to register was ever charged with any form of terrorism-related issues. Religious profiling. The New York Police Department, I was part of a lawsuit in New York City against the New York Police Department, which is the largest police force in the United States of America by far, that created an entire demographics unit that was tasked with mapping our community. They literally created a map of our community. Here are all the mosques. Here are all the Muslim-owned businesses and restaurants. Here are where the Muslim children play soccer. Here, sending informants to our Muslim student associations, into our mosques, recording sermons of our imams, literally stifling free speech in the Muslim American community. In my community, specifically where I'm from in New York City, it was to the point where our coffee shops wouldn't even put the news up. When you go in to play, Muslim men go into the hookah shops and playing cards, no Al Jazeera, no Arabic news, because they did not want to even promote the speaking about politics, worried about these informants that were coming into our spaces. You could go to the mosque, you don't know if the person next to you in the masjid is an NYPD informant. That's how insidious the United States government was engaging in the profiling of our community. So there have been many lawsuits against the Federal Bureau of Investigations. We also know about the entrapment of young Muslim men, oftentimes in these bogus terrorism cases, justifying the bloated budgets of the United States government's FBI as well as local law enforcement. So our community doesn't just, when we talk about Islamophobia, it's not about what my neighbor thinks or what my university professor thinks of me or what my views are. It's about a systemic way to stifle free speech and to literally strip Muslim Americans of their civil liberties, and by promoting to the American people that you have to support us, because in order for you to maintain your civil liberties, we got to take these people's civil liberties. And most Americans, especially in New York, when asked about the NYPD surveillance program, they supported it. They were willing to give up the civil liberties of their Muslim neighbors so as long as they were safe, because the United States government told them, we're going to do these policies in order to keep you safe. So if that means the Muslims are going to be targeted or oppressed or whatever they think is happening to them, let's be okay with that. And generally speaking, the American public has been, in fact, okay with that. And finally, I'll say, and Dalia said something that's really important that I want you to listen to one more time. There is anti-Black racism in this country. There's anti-Semitism in this country. Ableism, sexism, misogyny, all the things exist. And there also, some of them are quite systematic, including anti-Black racism. But what's different about Islamophobia is if you are a news commentator, or you are on national television, or you are a person of high profile, or you are a CEO of a company, and you say something that is anti-Black or anti a particular community, or you say something that could be deemed anti-Semitic, you're canceled. It's over for you. You will no longer have a radio show. You will never see the newsroom of MSNBC. But in this country, it is actually acceptable to be anti-Muslim and anti-Arab. And not only is it acceptable, and oftentimes you are promoted for having these types of views. In fact, it is seen as courageous to have a view that is negative of Muslims, that you are a person that's saying what needs to be said. So I think that's the thing that scares me the most about Islamophobia, that it is an actual acceptable form of bigotry institutionally in this country. People go to Congress based on platforms that are anti-Muslim, calling for things. Donald Trump won an entire election. Don't let anybody fool you. He won an entire election on being anti-Muslim and by calling for the ending of Muslim migration to the United States of America. That is what sent him to the White House.
And he's saying again.
And he's saying, send me again, because I'm going to do the same, if not more than that. And there are people in this country that are moved by this kind of rhetoric.
Can I just add a two-finger,
Go ahead.
Small detail? I think what Linda said is quite correct. When it comes to the NCERS program, Armenia was also included. It took the Armenian lobby 3 days to get out of that list, and they were no longer in the NCERS. Which again goes to your point of the importance of, yeah. They were organized and they were effective.
3 days and they're like not on the list.
They're off the list in 3 days.
Wow.
So Islamophobia is not the irrational or hysterical fear of Islam and Muslims. There's a political goal here. Mm-hmm. The rest of the definition, which we often forget, is irrational fear of Islam and Muslims to lead to their marginalization from civic and political life, right? So that we believe we don't belong, that we are not part of the fabric of the nation, and so that we don't engage politically. So there's a political objective. Strategically speaking, if you look at just the past several election cycles, we can go back as far as the hysteria around the so-called Ground Zero mosque, which was not a mosque and not at Ground Zero, but it was the hysterical summer up to an election. And in New York City, there were protests around a victory mosque, right? And it was the Muslims are coming to celebrate. None of this was true, but it was a hysterical summer that led to the election of
the Tea Party.
Really undemocratic members, which was kind of the birth of the Tea Party, to be elected into Congress. And as soon as the election is over, we no longer talk about Park 51 or the Ground Zero Mosque, even though it still exists today.
Let me ask you this question. For Muslims to really engage politically, is it a must for them to be represented by an Islamic party or an Islamic individual that holds the Islamic flag, or like my interest can be represented in a state where like I'm not represented by a Muslim even?
So, let's take a lot of steps back, right? What is Islamic? Right? So if we just really want to go to the basis of our maqasid sharia, right? It's what? Sanctity of mind, health, body, right? And so what does that mean? That we need to have mandatory health care? That we shouldn't be engaging in genetically modified grains? That there shouldn't be unjust economic social structures, right? That's what's Islamic, right? And when we tend to think about these in these really large terms, in terms of Islamic political parties, Islamic international associations, right? When we think in these larger terms, 1/4 of the world's population is Muslim. And they are not only not a monolith, to insist that there are Islamic issues actually denies the Islamic identity of many. It actually denies the plurality of our faith. And so we have to kind of move away from this kind of what is an Islamic issue or who is the Islamic leadership. Because if in our interpretations of faith, there are many, many books of it that were at the same time, then how can we in 2023 say that there is an Islamic issue, an Islamic political party, an Islamic international institution? So that's at the international, like the OIC. They just held a conference on sustainability development goals in terms of agricultural development and food security. Right? But did that engage in conversations on what are IMF and World Bank loans doing to much of the Muslim majority nations, right? Talk about unjust economic practices, about genetically modified grains. These are the nuances of what it means to be just. But if you come into the United States and you talk about what does it mean to stand for justice, it has to be not standing for just us. It has to be a much broader of what does it mean to actually stand by what the values of the founding of the nation were, and how far removed we have ever been from them, and how further removed we are today. And so it's not about what are Muslim children going through. It's about why is it that 1 in 4 children in America is hungry? Why is there still structural injustices in our education system? And so until we kind of take a broader picture of what are real Muslim values and that they are divinely designed to not be limited, but actually to be broad, to include all of the so-called secular issues that we face, that is how we really engaged in social change.
Thank you for this answer. Trita, when it comes to international realm again, the idea of like different UN representatives come to the podium and start to defend Muslims being suppressed worldwide. The idea of, for instance, an Iranian or a Turkish or even Saudi or Qatari representative come and say, Myanmar been like in a bad situation, Muslims over there. People are taking advantage of Muslims worldwide. Do you think the idea of giving this kind of platform or podium for states to start and taking advantage of Muslims issue worldwide is still a viable or a good idea when it comes to international organizations like the UN?
So, good idea, no, but at the end of the day, there's no way you can prevent this. This is happening all the time, all around the world, where people are taking advantage of existing frustrations and using it for their own purposes. You mentioned Turkey. Iran certainly has done this. Iran has, for the last 40 years, tried to present itself as the champion of the Palestinian cause, but it's mainly been doing so, not because it doesn't have sympathies with the Palestinians, but because it's a way for it to advance its own leadership credentials in the region and try to outdo or paint the other geopolitical rivals that it has as not being sufficiently concerned about these issues. Unfortunately, this is unavoidable. You're not going to be able to wish this away. The only way that you can really mitigate it is to make sure that some of these issues actually are resolved. And this is where this is just my personal hope, to see the Muslim community and the larger community here, which trends that we're already seeing, to help shift U.S. policy when it comes to Israel-Palestine. In my personal view, we would not be in the situation that we are in today in Israel-Palestine had it not been for the degree of support that the United States has provided for a policy that clearly was going to lead to this situation. We're pretending. I mean, I don't think anything has been as dead as a peace process while everyone is still pretending as if it's alive. And it's, this could not have happened had it not been because this very, very strong degree of support, which in my view does not serve U.S. interests. It is destabilizing the region. It is creating all of these different wounds in the region that are then used and abused by others. And I personally don't believe that the United States can be a solution to this, but it certainly can stop being the degree of facilitator of this process, particularly now when we're talking about the administration's top agenda item being the further integration of Israel in the region without any meaningful changes in Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. Even when they're talking about concessions, the way Tom Friedman formulated in his New York Times column was that some concessions would be made in order to keep the idea of a two-state solution alive. Forget about a two-state solution, the idea of it alive. This is preposterous. If there's one thing I think most people in this community could at least agree on is on this. And this is where I think it could have a profound impact on U.S. policy, which would have a profound impact on the situation in the region as a whole.
Thank you so much for this answer. Linda, again to the American situation. When it comes to Muslims' voting behavior, after 2001, especially like what happened in 9/11, we saw Muslims start to act differently when it comes to voting. And now we see a kind of like another shift, if we may call it. At the end of the day, if we see a contradiction or a paradox when it comes to my values and what are the policies that comes out of this regulatory body I've been voting for, this is a contradiction. Like, how is Muslim doing when it comes to voting behavior?
You're opening a big wound for me, Mohammed. I'm struggling with this question here. I think just for folks in the room, the context is that pre-2001, a significant portion of Muslim Americans were actually registered Republicans. Many of them aligned on issues, social values, on issues around economics, taxes, and so we saw a significant portion of the kind of generation before mine and one before that were mostly registered Republicans. And then in 2001, after the horrific attacks of 9/11 and the ways in which the United States government and many of the Republican Party in particular just dove in on this anti-Muslim sentiment and kind of started doing the Islamophobia that marginalized us out of civic life, our larger Arab American and Muslim American community started shifting political parties. To be quite honest with everyone here, and people know me very well, I don't think that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party fully represent us either way. And I don't think that even till now they do or have even in the last 20 years. But I think the Muslim community was always looking for a political home. And so we started thinking about things from a place of consensus. Of course, we don't agree with the Democratic Party and everything. Even foreign policy, the Democrats and the Republicans, when it comes to Israel, are the same. To me personally, I don't see a big shift in the ways in which they look at foreign policy issues specifically. But on domestic issues, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to issues of immigration and refugee resettlement, when you think about fair wages and workers' rights, when you think about women's rights and women's issues in the United States, public education, there are places for us as Muslims where we saw ourselves maybe at least we could be with a party that's going to defend refugees and defend immigrants. And so now so that was post-2001. And relatively speaking, we have been mostly registered Democrats right now and voting with this kind of political party, knowing that they are still far away from where we need them to be foreign policy-wise. And now we're in a different moment, and it's a very scary moment, and all of you in this room are here because you're probably professionals, you're people who are in tune with these kind of conversation. There is a culture war happening in America right now, and the Republicans have become very sophisticated. At some point, they marginalized us, right? The Muslims shifted a little more to the Democrats. Democrats started winning a lot more in local offices in Congress, right? We saw the rise of the Bernie Sanders movement, progressives raising Palestine in the left-wing part of the Democratic Party, and all of a sudden Muslims started having political influence. Nobody believed Bernie Sanders could win a primary in a place like Michigan. It was to the point where Hillary did not move. She didn't even go to Michigan because she was like, I got this. And our Muslim American community organized and mobilized and gave Bernie Sanders the biggest political upset in American politics. He won in Wisconsin. He won in places he should not have won, but he won because of our vote. And all of a sudden, the Muslim vote became a thing, a phenomenon. And so what did the Republicans do? They've been studying our community. Now, the Muslim American community, as you know, we are not monolithic, but we do have some conservative values, right? We also have what people in this country would consider progressive values. I believe that Islam in of itself is a faith that already believes that workers should be paid fair wages, that no one should die because they don't have access to health care, that people should be respected regardless and dignified regardless of their race or religion or ethnicity or whatnot, right? That our children should all have access, that our neighbors shouldn't go to bed hungry. We have these values already. But in America, they call this progressive. But we also have some values that would be deemed conservative. But the Muslim community figured out a way to reconcile that, to say, we're going to focus on the issues that bring us together. And that's why we have been voting in this particular way. Now the Republicans said, we're going to find some sensitive issues. And they found them. And now they are slowly infiltrating Muslim communities, as you know, on education, on book bans, on, you already know where I'm going with this. And unfortunately, there is a big disinformation campaign out there. I'm not saying that the concerns may not be real for some parents, but there's generally a disinformation campaign that's being run by people with money that have created groups like Moms for Liberty and others that are pushing these things in different school districts. And so our Muslim community, some folks, are now part of this culture war. They are willing, some Muslims, not all Muslims in Muhammad, some Muslims are willing to give up fair wages, economic justice, right? They're willing to give up health care. They're willing to give up funding for public education. They're willing to give up the protection of refugees, right? Raising the cap for refugees, protecting refugees, immigration reform, a lot of issues that impact our community because of one issue that has been now used by the Republican Party to divide Muslims and to really peel Muslims off from the Democratic Party. And in some places it's working. In New York, not in Alabama or in the South, New York, progressive New York, we lost 5 congressional seats to Republicans in New York. And so this is a big concern of mine. And I'm hoping that in 2024, which you know is going to be another major election, that inshallah, our Muslim community is sophisticated enough to understand that you can be true to your faith, be true to your values, and also not make a choice that can further harm people in this country who are already harmed, further oppress people who are already oppressed, take health care away from more people, take social services away from more people, reject more refugees that should be welcomed into our country, rejecting migrants at the border. That I hope our Muslim community is more sophisticated not to fall for what I believe to be the scam of the Republican Party. That we could be strong and you could advocate for yourself, but not to give up an entire political agenda that lifts people because there's an issue or two that we may not agree with or our Muslim communities may not agree with. So that's what we see potentially a trend. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but we're starting to see these very complicated conversations starting in the Muslim American community.
Jamil, thank you. Linda, Professor Dalia, when it comes to this comparison between 2001 and what's going on now, the voting behavior of Muslims, what's the difference? Because at the end of the day, what happens in 2001 is a shifting from one party to another, but they were affected directly. But now this shift is kind of different. Like Muslims are not the only people who's being through or going through this wave of like I'm gonna call it, I wanna be a man again, this manhood wave, let's call it. Because at the end of the day, this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not only specifically towards Muslim. So what's the difference between what's going on back then, or what happened back then and now? This is one part of the question. The other part of the question is it that easy for Muslims to just shift and go from one party to another? Or it's really difficult to make them go to another party?
So it's not the man wave or the Jordan Peterson wave, right? It is another version of populism, and populism has been on the rise in the world for quite a while, right? This is just the next iteration. But if you look at Muslim community vote in terms of like NES data, around 2000, right, Muslims were a single issue vote, right? And it usually was foreign policy, right? We weren't talking about the list that Linda just gave us about real domestic bread and butter issues. And so when we were a single foreign policy issue, right, the real shift happened was really the Gulf War, right, where Muslims started to say, wait, we like Republicans, but we're not sure how this is going. And then ultimately 9/11 kind of solidified the move. But again, it was really single issue vote. What happened in the last election, and so I have two of my colleagues and I have a study coming out where the data around, again, national election survey data, was that the 2020 election demonstrated that the heart of the Democratic Party was the Muslim vote. We used to take for granted the Hispanic vote, right? What we saw in the last election is you can't, right? Hispanics in Texas and Florida, right, voted overwhelmingly red. And so what you saw, the Democrats saw, is that Muslims are increasingly becoming the heart of the Democratic Party in terms of the vote. And so knowing that, statistically speaking, if you want to win the next election and never let an incumbent not win an election outside of war, war is the other kind of indicator, is that you need to split this vote. And the unfortunate reality is that the Muslim American community has taken identity politics indeed as our single issue. So we went from a multi-issue, dynamic community to returning to a single issue, which is identity politics. And in the greater landscape of that is that we are now allowing the Islamophobes to hide behind us as we fight for their struggle to get back into office. And so, mapping the, Park 51 or Victory Mosque hysteria. After that, it was the anti-Sharia legislation, right? Every election cycle has its hysteria. This might not feel like hysteria. This is actually Muslims doing the work of the Islamophobes, which is successfully dividing the vote in the United States along identity politics. And the unfortunate reality is, bread and butter every day when they hear, oh, there's an attack on my children, there's books in school that I'm uncomfortable with, right? All of a sudden, we're talking about conservative values, and the conservative value is a single issue rather than values being the list that Linda was giving us about what is really kind of a family value platform. But leaving all of that aside, we have to think strategically. You can address major foreign policy issues if you're willing to let go very quickly for a single issue all of the political gains that you've had domestically over the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. And the unfortunate reality is that is where we're heading. And so foreign policy is going to go in absolutely dangerous directions, and the Muslim American community has lost its social capital in that regard. If you look at, it might be controversial to talk about Israel-Palestine normalization, but where are Muslims being persecuted where there is no one denying it? China, right? What is the one country that was established in the name of Islam? Pakistan. Pakistan refuses to condemn what is happening to Muslims in China. Why? Because it's the most heavily indebted to the very country of China. Mm-hmm. And so the former prime minister would say, that is not genocide, that is not oppression, that is China dealing with an internal matter, and they have the right to do so. And so when we talk about what are Muslim, let's not kid ourselves, right? We are brushing a lot of subjects with very large strokes and doing very little of them justice because we're insisting on staying on identity politics.
Very interesting. But I want to ask, going from the idea of what's happened between Pakistan and China, and by the way, it's not only Pakistan, like many other Muslim countries also, either they abstain or say, no, we disagree with the idea of condemning China for what they're doing to Myanmar or Muslims in Myanmar. Trita, when it comes to international realm, again, the idea of, we see, since before it was Saeed even, the idea of covering Islam and portraying Islam in a specific way is there. And the accumulation of this kind of portraying does exist. We're beyond now the idea of fact-checking, is it portraying it in a bad way or not? No, we're beyond that. But the problem now, we see this accumulation throughout time. And it manifests itself now in different individuals worldwide, leaders even, going out and saying easily bad stuff toward, or bad even positions toward Islam or Muslims. We see them now easily in a more it doesn't matter now. The more brave you are in your stand, the better it is when it comes to the populist, as Dr. Dalia mentioned, Professor Dalia mentioned, the populist ideas. So internationally, do you think there is any chance for people to lobby internationally for Muslims and Muslims issues? Do you think there is a way for people to go to New York, to the UN and try to lobby? Let's call it this way. Is it a thing that Muslims can do nowadays?
Certainly, but I think take it one step back. I think we have to recognize, and without naming any names, several Islamic Muslim countries have themselves, the governments have helped spread some of those sentiments as a way of fighting whatever political opposition they see, whether it's political Islam, etc. So this is not something that is just done by some countries in the West vis-a-vis Muslim populations. The picture is unfortunately more complex and negatively complex than that. When it comes to international condemnation, I think it certainly is possible, but I don't see it as easy for grassroots movements to engage in that. It's definitely possible. But you had, for instance, resolutions condemning racism at the UN, pushing to make sure that Islamophobia is recognized. These are important steps. I think we should be very careful, however, not to have too high expectation of what such symbolic votes, what that actually means on the ground. The question is really what happens afterwards. What do you do once the world has spoken and adopted such a resolution? What do you do with that in order for that to translate into domestic measures in various countries to fight exactly the type of systemic policies that have been put in place? Because otherwise it just ends up being another resolution at the UN saying something very nice, the sky is blue, ice cream tastes good, but nothing else happens after that. So I would say the real measure that populations, grassroots can do is what comes afterwards.
Thank you for this answer. Now we're going to have a last or a final round of questions to you guys, and then we're going to move to the audience and take their questions. Lynda, if you don't mind me asking, the title of this final round is Moving Forward. How we can move forward as Muslims here in the US when it comes to us being represented?
It's a big question.
All my questions are big today.
I think, what's important is that, again, our community is not monolithic. There are 50 states with 50 Muslim communities. Within those communities, we're intergenerational. We're young Muslims. Some of us are born and raised in the United States. Some of us are, born outside of this country. Some of us are naturalized citizens. There's just so much depth. Some of us are educated. Some folks in our community are working class people. So our community is just so, it's hard to find that, one cohesive agenda or that one cohesive strategy that everybody's going to adhere to and organize. Moving forward, Muslim Americans have to understand you live in the United States of America. You made a decision to be here, or our parents made that decision, which meant some of us were going to be born here. And we live in a democracy, a flawed one, to be clear, but it is a democracy. And in order for us as Muslim Americans to continue to live in a country where we can be fully Muslim American, where we can ensure that the laws of this land also apply to Muslims, we have to participate in this democracy. Mm-hmm. That is who we are as Muslims. That is what we are encouraged to do. We are encouraged to work within the confines of the laws of the land in which we live. And what's happening in this country is that the laws of the land, people are working to make the laws of this land not apply to us. That is why we've had mosque opposition and people that are literally trying to stop us from building religious institutions, right? That is why that there are systemic policies like racial and religious profiling of Muslim communities, policies, agencies, foreign policies based on these issues. So I tell Muslims all the time that in order for us to move forward, we have to understand that today we live in a country that has politicized us as Muslims. So you can't tell me I'm a Muslim and I'm not political and I don't like politics. I don't want to do politics. In America, if you woke up today and you are breathing and you are a Muslim, you are politicized in this country. So you cannot try to run away from politics and tell me that I'm going to be there's no such thing as an apolitical Muslim in America. If you want to be an apolitical Muslim, go live somewhere else and live in a Muslim country. And guess what? You probably got to be political there too. That's another panel for another day about Muslim majority countries and Muslim leadership and what does it even mean to have Muslims who are trying to lead based on Muslim laws, still oppressing. We could talk about that all day. But my point is that what I fundamentally believe is that I can raise my children in this country to be unapologetically Muslim, that I could be Muslim, that I could wear hijab, that I could practice my faith in this country, and that I could also fight for generations of Muslims to come to also be able to live in the land in the way that I do. And if Muslims retreat from politics in America, we may come to a point, Muhammad, where we will have taken our community back versus taking them forward. So to move forward, we are going to engage in this democracy. We are going to vote our values and principles. And I want to remind people oftentimes that we sometimes try to describe our faith in different ways. What I believe is that Islam is a religion of justice, and that we as Muslims should never make a decision that we know is going to harm others, including those from our own community. And so moving forward, I think having a commitment to racial, social, economic, climate justice is actually adherent to our faith. And lifting the most marginalized people in this country is adherent to our faith. And the only way in this country for us to move forward is to organize our votes and to organize our money. And if we truly believe in things like Palestine, right? It's so funny because we're talking about really quickly the shift in political behavior. Let's say the Muslims go with the Republicans on this one issue. You just sold Palestine down the river, whether you like it or not. So you could tell me I'm just trying to be Muslim in this country, but as a Muslim, you are willing to sell your Palestinian sisters and brothers by going to a party that is even more right-wing than the Democratic Party, because I'm not defending them either. You are selling Palestinians down the line. So I just say to Muslims moving forward, we have to stay focused, stay engaged, be unapologetically Muslim, and defend our right to be Muslim in this country. And that's the only way forward.
Thank you, Linda, for this answer. Professor Dalia, when it comes to international realm, now not Trita, it's her. When it comes to international realm, do you think there is any chance for Muslims to really come together internationally and start an organization or start a coalition of Muslims, whether Muslim ulama or Muslim citizens or whatever, be it what it is? But at the end of the day, do you think there is a chance for Muslims to come together beyond borders, beyond state, and try to do something to face issues that Muslims face?
So, like I said earlier, 1/4 of the world's population is Muslim, and 50-some countries are Muslim majority, which is about 1/4 of all the countries in the world. To assume that there can be a unifying message or a unifying issue or a unifying mantra would actually, again, erase the local identities of many of these places. And so if in our faith was the preservation of the turath of all of these places at the same time, then we need to ensure that that continues to be part of the preservation of what it means to have, whatever this Islamic ummah is. But to get back to the more real issues, every nation has its own strategic interest and national interest. And in the United States, we know that there is a lot of social pain, right? There's a lot of economic pain. There is so much pain that it could lead to even more marginalization and unfortunately violence in the coming years. I mean, real social violence that we haven't seen. Gun deaths are on the rise. America's going through something interesting, but it's unfortunately going to, I think the numbers tell us, go through a much more difficult moment. And if Muslims, in our values, see ourselves as of this country, then we actually have to participate in the healing of America. That it can't be, a list of grievances without acknowledging that if we are of this country, we actually have to participate in the definition of what the future of America is going to look like. And so really staying locally, if our values are going to be translated into action, then it's going to require that social engagement with my neighbor, right? In Islam, we're told neighbor has rights. How many of us really know our neighbor? How many of us really engage at the local level, right? At the real level. I started at the outset saying that, according to Pew, there's a 78% of Americans have a negative association with the word Islam and Muslims. That number drops significantly to 23% if that American can say, I indeed know a Muslim and engage with them. So that the greatest mitigator of anti-Muslim sentiment is what? Engaging with a Muslim, right? And so to be part of the fabric of the country, especially at a critical juncture like we're in today, is not just going to be in our benefit, because we're not talking about strategic here. We're talking about really capturing what could potentially be the future of the United States. Moving it to a grander scale, again, every nation state has a strategic interest. There could be a redefinition of strategic interest or strategic security to include human security and human security of others. We know, for example, in the Middle East, and I apologize for talking about Egypt for a while, but it's what I primarily research, that we've seen countries like Egypt and now, unfortunately, much of the post-Arab Spring states as democracy and stability are two sides of the same coin. I can't give these people democracy because look at the instability it creates in the world, right? So we accept repressive regimes. But think about that human security, right? We know that countries that are in this level of oppression ultimately do become ungovernable. And so human insecurity is going to feed what? Regional instability, right? Which leads to insecurity of us here in the United States. And so there could be a potential that we start to redefine national interest to include international human interest. And at the Muslim level, of the top 15 wars happening in the world today, 13 of them are happening in Muslim-majority countries, right? The others are Ukraine and the Mexican drug war. And so if we think about the deep impact, right? 60% of refugees in the world are Muslim, right? The majority of orphans in the world are Muslim. That it's going to take a strategic rethinking. You know, my professors used to say, you got to rearrange the furniture in your brain to actually think about the possibility of change in the future. So it's easy to throw around titles like Islamic organization or Islamic establishment or Islamic political party, but if we're not addressing real issues, then it's just more window dressing. Mm-hmm. And we're so far beyond that.
Thank you so much for this answer. Trita, one last question. So when it comes, I remember one of my friends, her name is Dalia Fahmy, and she's a professor at Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. She wrote an amazing article about how, especially after the Arab Spring, people in Arab countries start to deal with the government based on what they're doing in the Palestinian case. So based on how their government is doing in the Palestinian case, they are facing the government and even objecting to many of their policies. So my question here is, to what extent do you think, because for Muslims, I think the Palestinian case is very important, like it's part of them as Muslims, if I may say, but to what extent do you think this will affect the way the U.S. is dealing with this case in the future, especially if they see, like on the ground in Egypt or in Tunisia, whenever you see a Tunisian flag, you see a Palestinian flag next to it. Do you think these kind of stuff will, especially after we're talking about generations, after the Nakba or after the 40s, do you think this will change the way the U.S. is dealing with the case?
One could hope so, but I would say that there's a more profound challenge here in which the U.S.'s approach to the Palestinian issue is in many ways subordinate to that. The United States has had a policy for many decades now of seeking military domination in key strategic regions. Everything that it does is serving that purpose. And as long as that has been the approach, that has also meant that the treatment of Israel, the treatment of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a function, partly, not only, to that objective. Israel has been a state that has been one of the greatest demandeurs of a strong U.S. military presence in the Middle East. So has a few other countries that have also benefited from this. But as long as that has been the case, that means that on the most primary issue of importance, which is not one that is often talked about, the Israelis have been on the side of supporting the grand strategic goals of the United States in the region as a dominant military power. Unless, in my view, you have a shift in that American position, which incidentally has started to take place, but may be reversed now, if you have a normalization deal that entails Article 5 level security guarantees to Saudi Arabia. That would mean that the American commitment to the security of one state in the region has gone beyond what has ever been in the history of the United States. Prior to that, you had the Carter Doctrine, you had the Reagan variation of the Carter Doctrine, but there was no binding agreements. That means that the United States would go back into, we've been in it 5, 6, 7 years in which there's been a desire to reduce the military footprint in the region. And I incidentally believe that that has been a critical reason as to why we have seen in the last couple of years an intra-regional and intra-Arab as well as an intra-regional détente taking place in the region. And it's partly because once certain states have recognized that they can't hide behind American military power, guess what? Suddenly diplomacy to resolve your tensions with the neighbors becomes much more attractive. Mm-hmm. Because the other, that option always existed, but it wasn't the top option, it was the most attractive one because you could hide behind American military power. When you cannot, then suddenly your incentive structures change. But if we go into these security agreements, then I think it will completely securitize the region. The United States would do so because it's seeking to make sure that it retains that degree of influence in the region in order to prevent the Chinese from entering the region. And again, instead of certain superpower influences in the region manipulating the geopolitics of the region in a way that I think, again, we have seen some clear signs that it actually been positive for the region, because the region has actually had some agency of trying to resolve its own problems on its own. We're going to go back into which the Middle East will become a playing ground for rivalries between the United States and China. And I think that will have an absolutely devastating effect for the region. I personally think it's also ultimately going to be very bad for the United States.
But this might be not a very direct question to our panel, but do you think China will go on the ground and like battle and rival the US as the Russian did before?
No, it certainly does. I mean, the United States has 750 military bases around the world. And that's actually a reduction. It used to be even more. The Chinese have 2. Okay, so there's no closeness of parity in any way, shape, or form there. It's more about a scenario in which, if the United States and China end up in a war, will the military assets of the United States be able to prevent the Chinese from being able to extract energy from the Middle East? Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's not about the idea that the Chinese are going to try to be so foolish to play the same role the United States has played in the region. Mm-hmm. I mean, I would not wish hegemony in the Middle East on my worst enemy. What's the benefit of that? So why would the Chinese seek such a? They have played it, very cleverly. They have just had economic relations. They stayed out of all different conflicts and focused on their own interest. And when they have been able to play a constructive role, such as between the Saudi-Iranian detente, they've done so. But keep one thing in mind. You had a normalization between Iran and Israel. The Chinese played a role, not a critical necessarily, but there was no agreements to build military bases in Iran or Saudi Arabia. There was no security guarantees offered. It was none of these different things, or arms sales, that otherwise is always part of the package when the United States do these things. And when it does, in my view, it has contributed to the destabilization of the region in the long run.
Thank you so much for your answer. Now, the Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions, please raise your hand. So we have a question over here.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to thank you for your kind remarks. It was a really insightful conversation. Actually, the only reason why I registered Democrat was to vote for Bernie Sanders in the last primary election. Unfortunately, I'm from Maryland, and the primary didn't get to me, but inshallah next time. Inshallah. I would like to just touch briefly on the foreign policy side. Ustadha Dalia, you talked about the oppression of the Uyghur Muslims in China, but I would make the case that Muslims are oppressed all over even including the Arab and Muslim world, and obviously this is in large case a direct result of the military dictatorial regimes that succeeded that succeeded independence and certain monarchical regimes and other dictatorial regimes, even if they were in civilian clothing. And on the topic of Palestine, it's easy to talk about how the U.S. funds Israel and funds the occupation, but ultimately the Arab regimes were the first to betray the Palestinian cause. I think this past month, the documents regarding the 73 war were released, and the King Hussein actually met with Moshe Dayan the day that the war started. So even in the time where the Arabs were considered to be victors against Israel, there were other Arabs that were betraying the Arabs that were, fighting. And even now with the normalization of UAE with Israel, Al-Utaiba came out just the other day saying, we normalized under the condition that there were going to be true improvements for Palestinians, but now it's the role for the next normalizers to kind of pick up the slack. If you're going to enter a haunted house without knowing where the door is, why do you enter the haunted house in the first place? It doesn't make sense. Yeah. So my question ultimately is, don't you think that a real kind of democratization in the Middle East will not only help the citizenry in the Middle East, but will also help the standing of Americans here? And what can we as American Muslims or Arab Americans do here to kind of promote the kind of necessary change that we need back home? Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can answer this if you want.
Oh, all that's for me?
Could I just say something really quickly to that? I think the title of this particular session that we're in today, which is Bridging Muslim Communities and Their Government, I think something that you brought up that's really important in light of this conversation is that those examples you gave are stark examples of where the Muslim communities and their governments are not aligned. If you went to the streets of any of those nations that have engaged in normalization with the state of Israel, you will find that the Sha'b, the people, are not with those governments, and that the governments are making decisions based on the personal nation interest and not the interests of their people. And because of the lack of democracy and the lack of participation of the citizenry of those nations, that's why there is no influence on these quote deals or the kind of dealings around policy and foreign affairs with these nations. And the thing about it is that what people will argue, not me because I'm not a foreign policy expert, I'm just a person that watches what happens around the world, is that we've watched what people will say are attempts at democracy, right? Or revolutions to democratize some of these, like the quote Arab Spring. And there's this idea that because the Arab Spring didn't work this time, that there's khalas, like we tried it, it didn't work out, and we kind of moved on from that. And I think that there has to be some sort of consistency and persistency in the promotion and people around the world really showing support to the peoples of the Arab world, and really any place where there are monarchies or dictatorships, that democracy is something that is not something that is gonna happen and it's gonna be perfect the first time. It takes time, it takes years, it takes potentially generations to perfect a democracy. And we've seen here in the United States, where supposedly one of the most important democracies in the world, and we still haven't gotten it right here. So I think that we have lowered the morale for people in North Africa, you were to saw Syria, we could Yemen, we could name all the places where the kind of people rose up and the immediate kind of oppression of the people trying to do that. So I feel hopeful that at some point we will get to that place, but I'm still sad to see the results of what have happened over the last 15 years.
You want to add anything, Dr. Dalia?
I think we also should be very careful of thinking that we here in the United States or in any Western country can speak on behalf of those who are living in those countries, and that any real change is going to come internally. And so sometimes we tend to think, especially Muslims in the West, that we have some kind of hegemonic control over all of Muslim community, Muslim issues, right? But real change comes from within communities, within those states, right? Of course, there's support, but it has to be seen as an inherently internal issue. And on the normalization, this was a strategic economic agreement. And not a single Palestinian leader was consulted. So, let's not kid ourselves, right? Let's say things for what they are.
Thank you so much for this answer. Another question over here.
Thank you so much, all. I want to start from the first round questions you posed and the answers that were raised, especially on the point of wars and refugees. Yes, 13 out of the 15 wars are in Muslim world. 60% of refugees are Muslims. The result is we have increasingly bigger Muslim communities in Europe and the United States. And I think that's more important in the US because in Europe, you don't have that access for localities, for grassroots into politics, whether foreign policy or local policies. We don't see the kind of lobbyists and lobbying groups and pressure groups, Muslim groups basically having that effect in Brussels or in London or in Paris, but you see it here in Washington. You see it in districts, across the US affecting Washington as well. And my question here on twofolds, when as new generation, first generation of Muslims coming more and more to countries like the United States, how do we balance between priorities of this home, this new home in the US, but also priorities of homes we came from in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen, in Egypt. But also on the other one, you mentioned something very important, Dr. Dalia, which is we come from so many different communities. And as Muslims, especially first generations, we don't have the same priorities. My priority as a Muslim Syrian might be different from priority of an Egyptian Muslim or an Iranian Muslim or a Yemeni Muslim. So how do we balance between our priorities as also Muslim Americans, but also the priorities of the different priorities of the Muslim community we came from? And I think the case of Syria and Iran is very important here because at one time you have, of course, this continuous, conflict between the US and Iran. I think only because Iran now is called the Islamic Republic of Iran. If Iran is called, in my opinion, like just the Republic of Iran, if it was the same situation under the Shah, I don't think we'll have, like Islamophobia here is very clear in the policy against Iran. But again, yeah, like as a Syrian Muslim, how do we balance, for example, that priority with the situation, for example, between Syria and Iran today?
Are you giving this question to a specific guest speaker?
Anyone who can
or want.
All yours.
I'll just make a quick comment on the first part of your question, because you mentioned how you balance. It presumes a certain choice, and that choice exists perhaps in the first and the second generation. If you take a look at communities that have arrived as immigrants in the United States, by the third and the fourth generation, unless there is a particular trauma, they tend to blend in and become American Syrians rather than Syrian Americans. And as a result, the type of motivation that is necessary to become politically active in order to be able to have an impact or support for policies vis-a-vis Syria, etc., start to dwindle away. This is incidentally part of the reason why in the Jewish community they created, what is the program called? Birthright. Because of a recognition that Jewish American kids were becoming too American and didn't have the connection to Israel. So one billionaire underwrote the whole thing. You can prove some level of Jewish heritage and you get a chance to travel to Israel, and it was all for the purpose that some percentage of those kids will become passionate about Israel, and that is necessary in order to be able to sustain the type of political activism that community has been very efficient at. But the fuel of it is, at the end of the day, that passion. That passion is not there automatically. It has to be there for some reason. And after 3-4 generations, it will dwindle away automatically unless something is done about it. And sadly, I mean, most oftentimes, the only reason that passion remains is because of a trauma. So in some ways, if you're losing the passion, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Can I just add one quick thing, Mohammed? I'm from Brooklyn and I'm Palestinian, so I'm just going to say the truth because that's what I do. Some people love me, some people hate me. No one's in the middle. Our problem as Muslim Americans is that we're just not reflective of the faith that we follow in this country, right? And I'll give you an example. Muslim Americans, depending on which community you're from within the Muslim community, you are outraged by something that happened to you, right? So for example, Palestinians are seen as very political. We see a lot of Palestinians in racial justice movement and these issues because we come from a long-standing military occupation, long-standing activism, right? You won't find Yemenis until something happens in Yemen, right? There's a Saudi war on Yemen, and then the Yemenis are saying, stop the war on Yemen, let's do advocacy on Yemen. And of course, within that, there are people on two different sides, right? Same thing with Syria. MashaAllah, Syrian-American doctors, people, very affluent Syrian-American community that was long stand dormant politically. I know that because I've been in politics for over 2 decades. All of a sudden, Bashar al-Assad rises, the kind of civil war starts, and guess what happens? Syrians are out building organizations. Literally, 2011, there was about 20 Syrian-American organizations. Even the Syrians, which is a very tiny drop in the bucket in the larger scheme of the Muslim American community, even they couldn't figure out how to make one organization to advocate on behalf of the Syrian American people. They couldn't even get it together. Same thing when Egypt happened. There was the Mursi people, there were the Sisi people, like even within each of the conflicts that are happening in countries where and of course some of these countries of course have other minorities that are not Muslim, but just to give you an example, we can't even figure it out ourselves. There's always people on every side. And so for me, the balance is be consistent. We also as Muslim Americans are expecting other people to stand up for us when something happens to us, but where are the Muslims when things are happening to other communities? And that's the thing about us as Muslims. It's not inherently who we are. We are supposed to stand up against injustice, no matter who it is against. But we wait till something happens to us. We see Palestinian children bombed, dead bodies, and all of a sudden, there's a protest in Washington, D.C., Chicago's outside of New York. When there's no dead bodies in Palestine, nobody's outside. And so there's something inherently that we have to self-question ourselves. It's not about everybody. Everybody's the problem. The Zionist lobby's the problem. The United States foreign policy is the problem. What about if we're the problem? What about if our Muslim American community, if our Arab American community, if we are the problem? We are not self-critical people. And so I say to people all the time, the balance is be consistent, participate all the time, stand up for Palestinians when it's necessary, stand up for Syrians when it's necessary. When we see what's happening in Yemen, we stand up. When we are seeing what happens to our black neighbor who gets shot by a police officer, stand up then. When we see migrants at the border where the United States government is taking babies from their mothers, stand up for them then. And that's the problem, right, that we have. The balance is we haven't figured out how to fully participate in this country and are moved by emotions. Muslim Americans and Arab Americans, I use those interchangeably because of course there are, Christian Arabs and others that are also part of our community that, I believe it or not, fall into this culture too. We are inconsistent people. We are moved by emotions. And when we came to a country like the United States, of course there are people who have been in this country generations before us, including black Muslims and indigenous Muslims. But for our immigrant communities, we came from a culture, it takes a village. We come from this village mentality, right? We take care of our neighbors, we take care of our elders. We come to America, they teach us individualism. If you got an education, if you have health care, you have a car, your kids are good, your kids are healthy, what do you care about these people? Why are you getting in these people's business? You're good. You have health care, you're fine, you're a doctor. That is not our culture, it's not our religion, it's not how we were raised, and we have in fact been forced into assimilating the worst parts of this nation's traditions, which is every man and woman for themselves. I don't believe in that. And I think that most Muslims, believe it or not, have fell into everybody worry about what's in your house and don't worry about what's happening, including in our community. There are communities where refugees will tell you they've been treated poorly in Muslim communities, widows in our community, divorcees in our community, people who come to get support from our community and do not find that kind of support that we are inherently supposed to be giving. So I just say self-critique is very necessary in our Muslim American community here in the United States.
And just the extension of that is the proximity to whiteness, right? After a generation or two, you see yourself as closer to being white, right? And you want to drag me back into the narrative of oppression of my forefathers. No, I'm a good one, right? I'm a good one. And so, the extension of that is this proximity to whiteness. And that's something that all of our communities suffer from, right? Muslim and not, Arab and not, South Asian and not, is that once you've achieved certain markers as a community, there's a level of turning your back on everything else. And please don't drag me back when I've achieved this level of assimilation to whiteness.
Could I say something?
Sure.
I don't disagree with you, Linda. In fact, I think I over-agree with you. Let me explain why. When you say that the Muslim community is inconsistent, driven by emotions, not self-critical, you're describing every community in the country. I've had the opportunity to work with many different communities, particularly in the last couple of years. All of them say the same things about themselves. And all of them are right. This is the human condition. And there's no country more efficient than this country in keeping us so busy that we don't have time to think about anything else but ourselves. But in that, I think there's one small danger, which is not that it's not valuable to point this out, but to overpaint it as some sort of a characteristic can become disempowering, in which people will like, well, this is what we are, nothing I can do about it. Every community that has managed to organize and become efficient has recognized these things and recognized that they are highly changeable, and they have addressed it. And the Muslim community in that sense is absolutely no different. In many ways, it has significant advantages over others. So for instance, if you take Iranian Americans by and large don't go to masjid. They're not religious. It's become part of their identity not to be it as a rejection of the Islamic Republic, which also means that there has been no organizing nodes in the community. The Jewish community has the synagogues, the Armenians have the churches, etc. Organizing a community that doesn't have any infrastructure of community is extremely, extremely hard. In that sense, the general Muslim community, the non-Iranian, is light years ahead of in having some of those advantages.
Thank you guys so much. We're going to have a final last round of questions. 2 questions, actually. And then
pick a sister, please.
We should pick a sister. So sisters, please raise. Okay, we have a sister over there. 3 people. Final 3 questions. Yalla.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank the panel for sharing your knowledge and your opinions on everything. I found it to be really beneficial, but also refreshing. I work at a nonprofit that interfaces with marginalized women who are both either widowed or divorced. So I'm reflecting on the comment you made about grassroots work, but I'm also reflecting on a profound comment you made, Linda, which is you can't be Muslim and apolitical. And I'm thinking about the culture war, the social wars, just the different ways priorities are really resonating with marginalized individuals particularly. So how do we, if I'm interfacing with this demographic, like push towards, you know, an activist approach? And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be like a top-notch activist, but you have to feel an inclination to participate in politics. And it just seems to be really challenging when you're working with marginalized populations and even people who, again, closer to white are just, I'm good on my own, I don't need to be involved. I'm just curious about some inspiration on like how to change the narrative and ask them to get more engaged, whether it's marginalized populations, whether it's the youth as well, who just, again, hands-off kind of approach. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Thank you for this question. We're going to have another 2 questions, and then we're going to...
First of all, thank you all for a really wonderful discussion. Linda, this is in response to a comment you made, but I'm really open to commentary from any of the panelists. You were talking about how Muslims have kind of been co-opted by the culture wars. The right wing absolutely has pieced together some hot button issues, but I'd like to offer a little bit of respectful pushback to the idea that our community is kind of being unwittingly manipulated into going in this direction. I mean, to give an example, when I go next week to New Jersey, as I do once a month to visit my parents, I know when I go to Friday prayer that the imam of my local masjid is going to give a sermon that in some way deals with the culture wars. The programming, the social media of my masjid goes into these discussions and the insidiousness of certain hot button issues, basically playing right into the hands of the right. I'm pretty certain that there's no Republican funding going into my local masjid. I mean, these are imams and Muslim leaders that are acting on their own volition to be sucked into these culture wars. And I mean, it's really embarrassing to realize that I know a critical mass of Muslims who have stated that they will be voting for Donald Trump in protest of these issues. So my question is, how do we hold our own leadership accountable for steering us in this horrible direction?
Love that.
Thank you so much for this question. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I'm just going to follow up on that in the other direction. And something that he said earlier, both Linda and Dalia, around this idea of being co-opted. So we're putting a lot of blame on, or we're describing this as a function of being integrated, the passage of time, etc. But maybe, and I'll be a little bit provocative here, maybe this is a product of 9/11. So 9/11 and Sears was not just about being a citizen of a country, but being born there. So if you're a Canadian who's born in Egypt or a British citizen who's born in Egypt, you still had to register according to Sears, which enshrined the idea of the otherizing that came after 9/11. It was not about who you were, it was about who you really were, which is a Muslim. And so the last 20 years for the community and the leadership in particular, to me, has been about proving very hard that we're not other. And so we'll jump on the progressive bandwagon because that's the bandwagon. We'll get off that bandwagon and jump on the hard right because that's the flavor of the day, because that is what it means to be American. And we'll be more American than the American who says, I can be apolitical, right? So I think there is a dissonance between the rank and file and the leadership. I think the rank and file reacts very much as we heard earlier. I think the leadership wants to, present company accepted, wants to make us more American than Americans.
Saad, if you don't mind, I will take advantage of me being a moderator and also include one last question from the sister Ansari over there and also another sister over here. So 2 sisters. You asked for sisters. Here you go.
First of all, thank you for the critical discussion, especially with the upcoming elections. First of all, I'm an MA in US government at Johns Hopkins University, and I mainly specialize in lobbying, foreign lobbying to be more specific. And I find it interesting after reading what leading pioneers have wrote about Arab lobbying, and more specifically foreign entities lobbying, that there is a Saudi, Iranian lobbying groups, even Qataris. However, there is not a single effective Muslim interest or a lobbying group. So my question to Dr. Fahmy, since you've mentioned that Muslims are becoming the heart of the Democratic Party, what's pulling back the American Muslim community from effectively creating a lobbying or an interest groups that serves the interest of the Muslim community? And I'm not just talking about Congress, I'm talking about grassroots lobbying and affecting the American public opinion.
Thank you for this question. Al-Ansari.
Thank you, everyone, for this discussion. It's been very insightful. It's a pleasure to be here. So, Dr. Dalia, you mentioned that it's pretty common among Muslim Americans to believe that you can be both Muslim and American at the same time. You said like 1 and 2, if I'm correct?
1 and 2, youth.
Youth, exactly. So, my question is, do you think that showcasing of internalized Islamophobia or being soft on anti-Muslim sentiment is kind of weaponized or used as a survival mechanism among some members of the Muslim community, and that is like, you know, feeling that they have to vocalize or showcase some kind of tolerance for anti-Muslim sentiments to like secure access to communities or networks or even like any kind of benefit on a personal level? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. Who wants to start?
I'll start. And I appreciate your question, I think, and I appreciate something you said, Trita, because there is a next step. There's the self-critical part, which I don't even think our community has gotten to that step yet. And so that's why I brought it here in this room. In order to be self-critical, then you have to be committed to correction. And I don't think that our community is yet in that process, and that's the unfortunate reality. And inshallah, one day we will be in that process. But I think for me, I am still encouraged, and I'm still outside. That's my mantra. My mantra is I'm outside, and that means that I'm still organizing, even with the frustrations, even with the things that I've experienced within the larger Muslim American community, even as a Muslim American organizing in movement spaces. You know, people see me in women's rights spaces, I'm wearing hijab, they look at me, they're like, this doesn't make sense to me, like what's going on here? The pushback we get from being in spaces where there are still people in some movement spaces who are, for example, still, you know, I don't know what the word is, but basically people who are not yet our anti-boycott, divestment, sanction, for example, and then they see us at the table, and then there's tensions and movement spaces because there are Palestinians and pro-Palestinian voices and all of that. I'm still encouraged because I know that what I do today means something to a next generation to come, and that there has been people like me before, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, other women of color that came before me who paved the way for me to even sit on a stage like this today. So I encourage people to stay engaged. I may not see the fruits of my labor in my lifetime. I may not see a free Palestine. I may not see a burgeoning Muslim American community that is politically powerful and influential in America in my lifetime. But I know the little that I'm doing, the little that you're doing, the little that people in this room are doing, the studies that people are doing, the folks that are working on issues, all of that together is going to lead us into a better place. And so I encourage people to start on the local level. Don't look at us and say, oh, I want to be like Dr. Dalia, I want to be an academic, I want to be a foreign policy expert. Go to the school board meeting. You can't be mad about the book if you never went to a school board meeting. If you have never engaged in a parent-teacher association as a parent in the public school system, you go to the schools, show me how many Muslims participate in their children's education. So encouraging people in our community, in our congregations, our friends, do you go to the PTA meeting? Do you go to the school board meeting? Do you even know who your city council member is? There are Muslims who don't even know who their elected officials are. So that very basic political education and remembering that everything we do, we have to start somewhere. And that's my kind of encouragement. And I'll say to you, brother, absolutely we have to hold our leadership accountable. And our leadership too has been, I believe, because they could have did those khutbahs last year or the year before that or 20 years ago, because this is not a new issue. This is a thing. These people exist amongst us in our communities. But there still is a disinformation campaign. There is TikTok, and there are people going down as, you know, algorithms and seeing misinformation that's being passed. And I will tell you, I am a product, or I have been a victim of disinformation campaign run by the Russian government. in the front page of the New York Times, September 22nd of 2022, look it up, front page article in the New York Times, that the Russian government targeted me personally, believing that if they were able to slander, vilify me, they could undermine the Women's March and the anti-Trump movement that was happening at that time. So I just wanted people to believe that disinformation is a powerful tool of governments. Any government can engage in disinformation. If you have access to media outlets, platforms, social media algorithms, you could push whatever information you want forward. So I think that our leadership has also been victim to the disinformation campaign, which then causes them to make decisions that could be detrimental to our communities, which is where the accountability takes place. You want to have khutbah every Friday? I go tell my imam, I said, do one about opioid crisis. Do one about domestic violence in the Muslim American community. Do one about issues that are impacting our children every single day in the society. Do one about poverty. Do one about being active in your local community. How about that? How about that? Let's have that conversation. So I think there is a level of accountability that we as congregants have towards our imams. They should be speaking to the issues that impact us, that we should be engaging in that conversation with them as well. And so for me, I'll just say that I do still have hope for our Muslim American communities. And I do think that if we stop basing the way in which we show up in this country on our emotions, on things that move us in that sense, or things that are being, projected to us, and stay consistent and stay engaged and do the little things, like how many people in here know that there's an election every year, not just every 4 years or every 2 years. Every year there's an election. Your mayor, your city council. Muslim voter turnout has increased over time, yes, but it's still low voter turnout. Yeah. We are not voting 100% registered voters. And so I feel hopeful, but I'm still going to be self-critical of our community because I think we have such a long ways to go. But I hope that people in this room at least believe that all these big things that we want, free Syria, free Yemen, we want democracy in the Middle East, we want to be able to live in this country freely as Muslim Americans, might not happen in our lifetime. We just have to have more people who believe that we have to plant seeds today of trees that we will not see the fruits of those. And inshallah, that is something that we believe because other people before us in this country believed that black people would have the right to vote one day. Guess what? They died and they didn't vote, right? They wanted to see desegregated schools. They fought for rights that young black people are benefiting from today, although there's still systemic racism against black people. But somebody sacrificed for them before in order for them to be here today. And now we live in a country that's dismantling that. And we as Muslims have to stand up against attacks on affirmative action, attacks on all the different rights that have been won before us. And so I still feel hopeful, even in a very dark, dark world that we live in right now.
Thank you for this answer. You want to say something, Professor Dalia?
Sure. So about empowerment stories, here's an idea, right? Linda wrote a book, right? Our books are boring, right? She wrote a book.
Speak for yourself. Mine is amazing.
It's fantastic, but you can't have a study circle over it, right? Linda's story is actually a story of empowerment, right? How young woman, young mother can overcome certain things and become whatever everything, family, structure, society, community, school was telling you couldn't become, right? So we have actually really beautiful dynamic stories from amongst us that even those that feel so marginalized, right, can learn from. So I recommend everyone read, or actually listen to Linda's book. She narrates it herself. It's
with
really
my
lovely.
Brooklyn accent, my Fallahi English.
But in terms of like affecting change and lobbying and power, my congresswoman told me one time that if 13 people from her district write to her about an issue, she can't ignore it. I'm not saying donate. She's saying, however, hundreds of people will protest outside her office over an issue. But that doesn't lead to change, right? 13 people individually bringing issues to her office cannot be ignored. Why? It's a constituent issue. That level of basic organization, we do not do. In terms of lobbying, this is playing the long game, right? Which takes time and funds that you will not see the return on your investment in in this generation. And so what does it mean to build, I mean, we're talking about generational wealth and building generation. What does it mean to build community wealth in these moments, in these avenues? It means I have to be willing to say, I'm going to fund certain congressional campaigns and not necessarily see the fruits of this investment in this generation, right? We have yet to play the long game in politics, right? The long game in funding, the long game in actually, I mean, think about how many crises happen in the world, and in order for you to get an immediate meeting with your local congressperson, you need someone who's been a campaign donor to get you in. How many districts, strategic districts, where someone sits on foreign relations, right, have enough people who have donated to their campaigns historically that they could get us in the door to talk to them about a particular issue. And so as a community, we haven't organized in terms of not just lobbying, but how to get before certain Congress people at critical moments when we haven't built the social capital, right? In terms of funding campaigns, in terms of coming to their office on critical issues. And so these kind of playing politics in terms of the community long game, right, where we build generational influence has to be part of our calculus. Look, again, in the immigrant community, our parents' generation built institutions. They were not limited by a lack of imagination of their possibility in the future. Our generation and our children's generation needs to also not be limited by a lack of imagination, because our generation is guilty of just attempting to sustain the institutions that our forefathers built, not thinking beyond them in a dynamic way that says, what is our legacy going to be? And then what is the next generation's legacy going to be? We are limited by a lack of imagination, right, of what it means to belong and be of this country. And so when we have these deeper community conversations, we can begin to rethink not just belonging in the United States, but affecting change on the international stage.
Thank you, Professor Dalia. Tfaddal, Trita, you want to say something?
Sure, I just want to put in the record that my books are really exciting.
They are. To people like me.
I just say two things in support of what both Linda and Dalia have said. I agree 100% of the critical importance of being in touch with your members of Congress or school boards, etc. But what I think most of you may hear, and this is why I want to make it explicit, is that you should send them an email or a letter complaining about something. And it's actually the opposite. You have to constantly write them and say, thank you for this. Thank you for this vote. Thank you for this speech. Thank you for what you did on this. Because once you have done that, the one time when you have a complaint, it will be taken so much more seriously. Because you are then considered a person that is well-rounded. I mean, how much would you listen to someone who you never met before, never spoken to, and immediately that person comes to you and starts complaining? You're not going to take it very seriously. But someone who has made an effort to build a relationship with you by following what you're doing, supporting it, etc., then suddenly you have credibility. What we used to call it, when in my earlier life, I was doing similar things as Linda was doing. We call it political credit, in the sense that you should, as an individual, just as you're building your credit score, with every mortgage payment you're doing, you should do the same thing in your relationship with your politicians. Build a strong political credit, and because at some point you're going to need it, and then you have to have something to cash in. You don't want to be the person that comes in then when you really need something, they have no idea who you are, you never lifted a finger for them, you did nothing for them, but now you're coming with a bunch of demands.
Trita, thank you so much for accepting Qatar Debate invitation and talk in the Oasis of Dialogue in a topic that's really important to us. So we appreciate you coming here. Thank you so much. Dr. Dalia Fahmy. Also, Dr. Dalia Fahmy, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate your presence here and all the معلومات الرائعة اللي أعطيتني إياها اليوم. I'm going to say it in Arabic. I feel it's like يعني أكثر يعني. وأيضا أستاذتنا الرائعة ليندا. By the way, she's traveling tomorrow and she came, is it today or yesterday?
I just came this morning.
She came this morning and she's going to travel tomorrow. So thank you so much for coming and participating. And inshallah, Qatar Debate will keep this connection with you guys. We appreciate your presence here. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys for coming. This is the end. See you tomorrow, inshallah. Thank you guys so much.